Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in the Russian economy. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that we've been talking about the impact of the sanctions on the economy of Russia. And the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, recently published new statistics whereby they upgraded their forecast for Russia for 2024. And I've received lots of comments about this in the section below on various videos saying, how can you say that Russia is hurting from the sanctions when the IMF is saying that it's going to be one of the fastest growing economies in 2024? And the IMF have actually increased their figures significantly. In October, they downgraded their forecast for Russia from 1.3% growth for 24 to 1.1%. However, just recently, they've now upgraded that 1.1% to 2.6%, which is a material movement. But in today's video, we'll go through the details of what the Russian budget is looking like for 2024. And we'll also hear an interview that the head of the IMF gave recently, talking about why they see this increase in the Russian budget being detrimental to Russia and why Russia is facing tough times ahead. And heads up, spoiler alert here, the reason is that they've moved to being a wartime economy. And so the focus is now on production rather than consumption. And production only doesn't give you long-term growth. It gives you a short-term boost. But if nobody's actually buying what you're producing because you're producing lots of weapons that are being used in Ukraine that are a single use only, then in the long term, that will be detrimental for Russia. But we'll go through the details of that. We'll also talk about what's going on with IT, because the head of the IMF has also said that she believes that Russia is facing tough times because of its lack of technology. So we'll talk about what's happened with regards to the brain drain in IT. And we'll have a look at what's happened recently to the Russian equivalent of Google, which is called Yandex. Now, this company was expected to be nationalised shortly after Russia invaded Ukraine. That's what's happened to a lot of other key infrastructure in Russia. However, President Putin decided not to do that because nationalising that business would have had a really negative impact on all of its staff. It was likely that they were all going to leave. So what they've done is come up with a deal whereby they've bought it on the cheap. But we'll have a look at what the deal looks like and what's happened to the staff and what the implications of this are for the Russian economy. And then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary. So what I think the implications of Russia moving to a wartime economy are for the long-term prospects for Russia and what's likely to happen over the course of the next 3 to 6 months. But before we get into all of that, once again, I'd like to say thank you so much to everybody that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks over the last week or so, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And if you've signed up to be a patron or a member, I really appreciate that long-term support because it really helps to keep the channel going. As I said at the start of today's video, the IMF recently did a U-turn in terms of its outlook for Russia for 2024. As recently as October, the IMF stated that it was downgrading Russia's prospects from 1.3% growth to 1.1%. However, only a few months later, they've now done a complete U-turn and now said that they think that Russia will hit 2.6% growth. And that is a huge turnaround. Usually when adjustments are made to forecasts, they will be 0.1 or 0.2 or 0.3 in terms of the up or down movement. But what we've got here is a more than doubling of the outlook, and that does seem quite puzzling. But the reason for this is that the IMF has now changed the way it's evaluating Russia, and it's looking at Russia as being a full wartime economy. So Russia is now pumping billions of dollars into the production of weapons and machinery that it's using in the war in Ukraine. So let's hear from the head of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, as to what she thinks the impact of this movement to being a wartime economy is for Russia.
This is a war economy in which the state, which let's remember, had a very sizable buffer built over many years of fiscal discipline, is investing in this war economy. If you look at Russia today, production goes up, military, consumption goes down. And that is pretty much what the Soviet Union used to look like. High level of production, low level of consumption. I actually think that the Russian economy is for very tough times because of the outflow of people and because of the reduced access to technology that comes with the sanctions. So although this number looks like a good number, there is a bigger story behind, and it's not a very good story.
So as you've just heard, Kristalina Georgieva believes that Russia's movement to being a wartime economy will actually be a very tough period for Russia. And the reason for that is that if you're investing billions of dollars into things that are not going to have a long-term benefit for your economy, then obviously it's not going to benefit Russia's economy in the long term. If you're pumping money into missiles and tanks and weapons that will never be returned back to Russia, there's not going to be a long-term dividend from any of those projects. So let's have a detailed look at the Russian budget for 2024. This chart shows a detailed breakdown of Russia's budget for 2024. In the bar charts here, we've got 2023 shown in black and the 2024 figures shown in blue. And we've got 6 different categories across the bottom: national defence, social policy, national security, the economy, education and healthcare. And the scale on the right-hand side of this chart is shown in trillions of rubles and goes from 0 at the bottom to 15 trillion at the top. And just as a reminder, the current exchange rate between the US dollar and the ruble is around $1 for 90 rubles. So that means that 15 trillion rubles equates to somewhere in the region of $170 billion. So we start off by looking at the largest of all of these areas, which is national defence. The national defence budget for 2024 has been increased from 6.4 trillion rubles to 10.8, which represents an increase of around 69%. And the forecast level of spending on national defence equates to 38% of total spending in 2024. So this is by far the biggest increase out of all of these categories, and it is by far the largest form of expenditure. And in terms of providing a comparison, the USA is forecasting to spend around 12% of its total budget on defence. So in relative terms, Russia is spending more than 3 times that of the USA. The second largest category of expenditure is social expenditure. So this is things like pensions and benefits for people. And that's increasing from 6.5 trillion rubles to 7.5 trillion and equates to 26% of the total budget for 2024. The third biggest category of expenditure is expenditure on the economy. And interestingly, this figure is falling in 2024 compared with 2023. Last year, Russia spent 4.1 trillion rubles on growing the economy. In 2024, it's cut that figure back to 3.9 trillion. So you can see that the focus is more on defence than it is on growing the actual economy. The fourth biggest area of expenditure is national security, and the amount of expenditure on national security is increasing from 3.2 trillion rubles to 3.5 trillion and equates to around 11%. So when you combine national security and national defence, it equates to almost 50% of the total spending for the Russian economy. And once again, this really highlights the fact that Russia is focusing on defence and security rather than growing its actual economy. Now, if you look over on the right-hand side of this chart, you can see that the 2 smallest categories of expenditure are healthcare and education. And the investment into both of these areas is remaining entirely flat. In 2023, Russia invested 1.6 trillion rubles into healthcare, and it's budgeting to do exactly the same in 2024. And in 2023, Russia invested 1.5 trillion rubles into education, and that is remaining entirely flat also. And the combined expenditure into education and healthcare of 3.1 trillion rubles is less than half of the amount Russia is spending on national defence. So you can see that the focus for President Putin is really on the war in Ukraine, rather than developing the people of Russia through education or helping them through healthcare. And in percentage terms, 5% of the budget is going into education and 5% into healthcare. And as a comparison, the USA is investing around 13% of its budget into education and 17% into healthcare. Now, we've talked about the impact of the war in Ukraine on the population of Russia in previous videos, and this is having a detrimental impact, particularly on the IT sector, the technology sector. And as Russia is facing sanctions from a variety of countries which are restricting its access to technology, this is now causing a problem. And what I wanted to do in today's video is just to remind you of some of those figures. Immediately following the start of the war in Ukraine, it was estimated that around 500,000 people fled the country. They no longer wanted to live or work in Russia. So Russia lost a vital part of its workforce. And in the autumn of 2022, just after President Putin announced that he was mobilizing a further 300,000 men to go and fight in Ukraine, it was estimated that an additional 700,000 people left the country. So in total, 1.2 million out of a population of around 145 million. So we're talking almost 1% of the population. But when you dig down into the details and look at who actually left, it's the more educated people, the higher earners, and the ones who are doing a lot of research and development. And statistics have now come to light that it was estimated that in 2022 alone, 100,000 people who worked in the IT sector left Russia, and an additional 50,000 scientists decided that they no longer wanted to live there either. And the problem that this now presents to Russia is because it's being starved of the latest IT from around the rest of the world. It needs its best people to be on point and to be delivering new research and development and IT so that Russia can stay at the same pace as the rest of the world. But of course, if all of your best people, if all of your researchers, all of your scientists, all of your IT specialists have decided that they no longer want to live in Russia, then that causes you a double whammy because you're losing the tech from other countries and you no longer can produce your own tech because everyone who is doing it has departed. And the problem with technology, as we've talked about before, is that it builds upon the previous foundations. So you need to have people who've been doing this for a while, and then you can develop further cutting edge technology. If all of your good people leave because they don't want to be there anymore, they would rather go somewhere else where they can continue working on cutting edge developments, then that's going to put Russia even further back. And that's exactly what we heard from the head of the IMF earlier. She thinks that the loss of technology is really going to damage the Russian economy in the long term. So let's talk now about Russia's version of Google, Yandex, which was recently sold.
It's often called the Russian Google. Now, search engine company Yandex has agreed to sell all its assets in the country to a group of local investors. The deal is valued at around $5.2 billion. Yandex is Russia's largest tech firm with businesses in search, advertising and ride-hailing. It was long viewed as one of the few companies in the country with the potential to be a global player. Those hopes were dashed when Moscow invaded Ukraine in 2022. The Kremlin has been engaged in talks for about 18 months to spin off the Russian businesses from Yandex's Dutch parent firm. But the negotiations were complicated as the firm was largely owned by Western investors. Now businesses accounting for 95% of Yandex revenue will fall wholly under Russian control. It's been bought by Consortium First, a new investment fund linked to energy giant Lukoil. The price is a 50% discount to its recent average market capitalization, reflecting a discount demanded by Moscow, which has welcomed the deal.
So as you've just heard, Yandex is the Google equivalent in Russia. So you may be thinking, well, why was it a company that's based in the Netherlands? And the reason for that was that the Russian owners wanted to list the company outside of Russia. And they actually launched an IPO on NASDAQ in 2011, where they raised $1.3 billion from overseas investors. And the plan was to grow this business for it to become a major competitor to Google. And in October 2021, which was before the war in Ukraine started, it hit a market cap of around $30 billion. So this was a seriously large company. But the problem that everybody faced was that 95% of all of the revenues were coming from Russia. So essentially, this was a Russian business that had an overseas listing. And we've talked about a number of businesses like this since the start of the war. Now, immediately following the start of the war, there was the opportunity for Russia to nationalise this business in the same way as it did with a lot of other infrastructure. But I think what's happened here was that President Putin must have been advised that if he did so, it was likely that all of the key IT people, all of the research and development and all of the software engineers would likely leave because they wouldn't want to be part of a business that had been seized by Russia and become nationalised. So instead of doing that, Russia has gone through this process whereby they've engineered what they're calling a sale. However, the total value that's been attributed to this business is now $5.2 billion, which is obviously significantly less than $30 billion that it was valued at before the war started. So Russia has basically bought this on the cheap. They have reduced the value significantly. Now, it's still operating predominantly as a Russian entity, so its global aspirations have gone. But I think what Russia has tried to do is maintain as many of the staff as they can to preserve the value. But fundamentally, as we talked about earlier in the video, a lot of IT people have decided that they don't care whether they work for Yandex, they don't want to work in Russia, and a lot of those engineers have departed both from the company and from Russia. And so the long-term value of Yandex as an international player is very limited. It's unlikely that anybody outside of Russia is going to want to log on to Yandex and do their search in Russian. Everybody's using Google. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because firstly, I wanted to address the issue of the IMF's forecast for 2024 because a lot of people have raised this and identified it as proof that they believe that Russia is doing very well. And the figures for 2024 are genuine. So the IMF does believe that Russia will achieve 2.6% growth overall for this year. But the reason that they're expecting that to happen is because Russia has diverted a lot of its energy and a lot of its investment into what's happening in Ukraine. And as I talked about right at the start of today's video, that investment will not yield anything in the long term, because if you're investing into tanks and missiles and weapons, that is a single-use investment. You're not going to get benefits from it for the next 20 or 30 years. Compare that to something like an airport or infrastructure or solar panels or investment into people, the creation of jobs. If you put money into all of those different aspects of the economy, then that should give you a long-term basis to help grow the economy because you're employing people, you're generating income, you're generating expenditure in the economy, and hopefully you have a domino effect which will grow and grow for the long term. When you're putting all of your energy and money into a war, there is no immediate benefit. You will not get any returns, and over the medium to long term, it's unlikely that that will generate anything for the economy. So that's why the IMF believes that the investment into the war in Ukraine isn't going to help the Russian economy in the long term, and it will cause problems and will make it very tough. And that's why the head of the IMF was giving the analogy of a return to the Soviet Union, because this is similar to what Russia was doing in the 60s and 70s. It was employing lots of people. They were all doing things for the state, but the long-term benefits just simply weren't there. And that's what we're seeing today. And ultimately, Russia is draining its reserves because it's having to use its national wealth fund to support a lot of these wartime initiatives. And if this carries on for the next few years, the Russian economy will run out of cash at some point. But the other thing I wanted to talk about in today's video was the impact on IT, because Russia is currently facing sanctions in terms of accessing the latest technology. So if Russia is going to keep pace with the rest of the world, it needs to have its best people working really hard to develop its own IT. But as we've seen from today's video, the problem that Russia has is that immediately following the war, lots of people departed Russia, and those people were the ones who were working at the cutting edge, the higher educated, the higher earners. And immediately following the mobilization announcement, a further 700,000 people left. So Russia is severely depleted in terms of its personnel. And in IT today, you need the best people to be working for you. And Russia simply doesn't have that. So Russia is now facing a genuine double whammy. It can't access overseas IT. It's been blocked from getting the latest technology, and it's going to struggle to develop its own technology. And I've talked about this before. In 2014, Russia faced lots of sanctions when it invaded Crimea, and it tried to develop its own IT industry. And unfortunately, from Russia's point of view, it hasn't really made any progress in the last 10 years, and the war in Ukraine has now knocked it back further. So the overall summary of today's video is that the budget for Russia for 2024 is likely to be higher than it was for 2023. The IMF have confirmed that. However, when you dig down into the details, the fundamentals tell us that the long-term prospects for Russia are actually getting worse as a result of it now focusing primarily on the war rather than long-term investments. And the access to technology from Russia's perspective is now extremely limited, and it's struggling to develop its own IT. So the long-term prospects for the Russian economy are getting significantly worse. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.